This week, it's all about the blueprint of a successful startup, which is basically saying from what we've noticed and what we've worked with, what we tend to find is a very suitable set of circumstances that really help a startup to be much more successful. I'm Dante St James, expert in residence at the Darwin Innovation Hub. If you've got questions, please pop them in the hands up or put them in the chat and we'll be able to answer those along the way. But in the meantime, please sit back, enjoy, and learn a bit about what we've noticed that really works well when it comes to startups that will succeed. I'll just quickly share my screen and get us underway. First up, what we're going to look at today is a bit about what a startup actually is. There's a lot of confusion with that. A lot of people think it's just a new business, but we'll look at what that is. The validation of an idea is where things generally fall down and we have to keep repeating and going back there to revisit it. It's all about your team, the financing method you're using, marketing, scaling, and the common mistakes that we see a lot of founders making as well. I'll just touch a little bit on marketing and a little bit on scaling because we do have some more webinars coming up that are specifically about those topics. But in the meantime, I'm Dante St James, as I said, working with the StartNT program, which is a program of the Darwin Innovation Hub, basically taking people from ideas through the execution and hopefully onto funding as well for those big ideas they want to develop. I also lecture at Charles Darwin University in design thinking for innovation and in entrepreneurship, sustainable entrepreneurship, sorry. I'm a meta lead trainer, still got that contract, haven't done much with it lately, but yes, still working with Meta as a certified lead trainer, have the LinkedIn local chapter in Darwin in the Northern Territory, head up the Australian Institute of Office Professionals in the Northern Territory, and a network partner of the Australian government's Be Connected program, helping to bring older people and vulnerable Australians into the digital economy. So what is a startup? What does it all begin as? Well, a startup isn't just a new business. It certainly is a new business, but it tends to be a new business that's delivering a new idea. For example, opening up a bookkeeping business is not a startup. That's just a new business. Perhaps you might look at starting up a new coffee cart. Again, a new business, but not really a new idea. So startups generally bring some kind of new idea to the table. What they tend to do as well is not have a very set idea of what that business is going to look like. They've got an idea, but it's very rough around the edges. It's not completely perfectly aligned with some spectacular goal in the future, apart from getting rich maybe, but it has offerings and services and products that will evolve over time based upon the feedback of the customers of those things. It also is one of those kinds of businesses that has the potential for rather rapid growth. And that's certainly very attractive for investors. It's very attractive for those early adoption customers who want to get in on something very early in the game and are usually willing to pay quite the premium to be on that. The startup environment, as opposed to the new business environment, although I suppose they both have levels of this uncertainty. Certainly, the uncertainty is very much a hallmark of going into the startup environment. What they often say about investments being high risk, bringing high reward. That's quite often what the startup method is. It's something which has a certain degree of uncertainty to it because there's not necessarily a defined goal far in the future. Standard business plans, for example, don't tend to work out very well with startups. They'll use things like the business model canvas, which then explains why they're doing what they're doing, but not necessarily that 5-year, 10-year, 20-year plan. They tend to have a certain amount of innovation involved. So they're not necessarily repeating something that's being done, but certainly you can duplicate good ideas and put your spin on them, but they tend to be a lot more innovative. They're taking something that's maybe already there and applying to something else, or taking the things they've already got, the resources they have access to, and applying those to something completely new altogether. Startups tend to be quite agile too. As things change, they tend to pivot very quickly and try something else. And quite often that build and iterate process they go into is, well, I'm going to try this out for 3 months. If it doesn't work in 3 months, pivot, try something else. Double down on the things that are working, chuck out the things that aren't, and that's how then a startup will generally move forward. So what are the things that generally happen when startups succeed? There's some pretty defined things that we've seen, and then certainly with the investments we've made, which have been rather successful over the last 6 years, and then also looking to the broader ecosystem as well, right out to Silicon Valley, the startup scene in both in San Diego, which is really burgeoning right now, and as well as in Israel, a very strong startup scene there too. What we're seeing is that these startups have very clear value propositions. That means that they know very clearly what it is that makes them different, why you should change everything you're doing and work with these people instead of perhaps going with a competitor. So that clear value proposition is a really solid thing that you have to have in order to be understanding what it is you need to be achieving as a startup. So I just got rid of that blurry background because it was really starting to annoy me. It's starting to speckle and swipe all over the place. So being very abundantly clear on what you're doing as far as your business, the thing that you're doing that is very, very very different and very new and very unusual, and who it's for, having that very clearly articulated helps immensely with a startup. The other thing is a scalable business model. It's something which grows beyond just you. We're not talking about self-employment. We're not talking about having a team of 2 people or 3 people, or a little shop front with employs a few people. We're talking about businesses that have the ability to go much bigger, to scale far further, and not necessarily by adding on 2 staff and then you've got double the capacity. We're talking about businesses that by their very nature, and tech businesses tend to fit this, that you don't have to add a lot of extra resources in order to get much bigger results. So that scalability is a very important factor when it comes to success of startups. A dedicated team, and I'm going to look at this a bit later on in a little bit more detail. That's how important it is. It's not just something which I can brush over, because it's so vital to whether your startup will succeed. And we see that market demand, an obvious thing is people are lining up to get into your business. People are lining up to do business with you, to buy your product. Then there's something going right. So that market demand, a strong demand for what you do in the market, whether that demand exists now or you expect that demand to come because of something you're developing that's new, that is absolutely so key to whether a startup succeeds or not. So why do then startups fail? And a lot do. A lot of startups just never get off the ground. And there's some pretty solid reasons why that is. And a lot of it comes from that lack of a market. There's not been any research done in the first instance to work out whether there is a market for that product or for that service. Secondly would be running out of cash. Quite often, people are bootstrapping businesses and trying to grow them and scale them out of savings or a redundancy package, or maybe a self-managed super fund, if you can even do that these days. Doing all these things really just and not having that certainty of the money that's coming through can derail any idea. If you've got a $1.5 million budget and you're trying to raise a $3 million product, well, you're gonna run out of cash really, really soon. The other thing is too, is just misusing the cash that you've got, going and getting fancy business cards, buying fancy cars and all that sort of thing doesn't necessarily have a return on investment when it comes to the growth of the business. Also, picking the wrong people and the wrong team. That is an immensely important part of it, because if you are super into what you're doing, you're very committed to what you're doing, but others aren't committed to what you're doing as much as you are, then that can be the difference between success and failure. And being outcompeted. You're probably not the only person who's doing the idea that you've got. There's someone else somewhere else out there. In one of our most successful investments we've made in Speed 3D, which is metal 3D printing, is someone who has a competitor in the marketplace. There is a very similar company that's developing a very similar technology out of Silicon Valley in the US, but they are years behind Speed 3D. So while Speed 3D is now at that time of scaling out to an international market, this company is just struggling to get the technology right, and they still haven't got it completely right. But if they are able to come up with something that's faster, cheaper, more portable, and able to scale much more successfully than our investment is, well, then we have the risk of being outcompeted. So part of what we do as an investor is then help Speed 3D and all the others with some kind of expertise that we have in the market to become more competitive, or to add whatever expertise we can into that to help them be a much more competitive company. Now, the validation is where things usually have to return to when they're starting to fall down. And validation, in its most simple terms, is just validating whether that whether that issue or whether that idea you've got is actually got any legs. We look for market demand. We look for the resource allocation that you'll have within that business. We look at what you're doing to reduce risk, what you're doing to create an investor appeal. Now, I'll run through those a bit more carefully. The market demand is simply that you've done the work to do the research to ensure that there is a market demand. You're not just assuming that people are going to love this. You've actually done the research, whether it's through surveys or any of the other things. And we'll look at that in a second about how you do those things to validate market demand. But also resource allocation is understanding what it's going to take internally within your team to produce the product or service that you want to produce. If that hasn't been worked out, well, then there's a high risk of that startup coming down. If risk is not something that's looked at, and quite often startups will need someone who is just dedicated to analyzing risk all the time, a risk manager of sorts, then you've got that position where anything can knock you over, anything can become a major issue for you. The investor appeal part of it is just ensuring that the idea is something which investors tend to have an interest in, that they've got some sort of interest in it. And a lot of that comes from the scalability and the amount of how big you can make this thing go, because bigger is better in the world of investor capital. And they're always looking for a way to make back their investment plus some on top in the most efficient and quick way possible. So investor appeal is getting something that can scale and rather rapidly. It's not going to take 20 years to reach a goal. It's going to do it in 1, 2, 3, 5 years, something like that. So how do we then do the validation? We do the validation of things like market research. We go out there and do surveys, ask people what's going on. Online surveys are just as good as anything else, just something which is going to give us a chance to get real world feedback, not just feeding off our assumptions. The ego of the startup founder, and I've been a victim of this myself, having started up a number of things and had a few of them fail as well, is that we often think that we know it all because we're close to it, we love it, we think we know it all, and we really don't. So getting that external validation is utterly important because you can't be expected to know everything. Landing pages or like a mini website of sorts is a great way to sort of introduce what you're going to do to then get people to respond to it. Or in most cases, in the very early stages, landing pages are used for gathering interest through email addresses. And then as you are developing the product and moving along, you keep in communication with people about what's going on until finally you do the release. And those people who signed up with an early interest tend to be your beta testers. They're the people who are the super early adopters. They're innovators themselves. They want to be the first cab off the rank. And so to do that, they then need to make sure that they've got the ability to be able to access you and you access them as well. Landing page is a great way to do that. The minimum viable product, the prototype. This is generally what you need to do when you're working in a situation where you cannot afford to spend the money to make the perfect product and release it perfectly straight up front. You release the thing you can. Even Apple never releases their first product as perfect. It's always got some quirks to it. The first iPhone didn't even have 3G internet, had no app store. It just had built-in apps that it had. By the time it came to Australia on the 3G version, it then had sufficient internet and an app store and apps that were actually useful in the iPhone. Likewise, the Apple Vision Pro is a product which is going to change that spatial computing kind of thing with a lot of augmented reality and using your fingers and your hands to control the interface. That won't be perfect when it comes out. It's only going to make about 10,000 units at $3,500 US each, which is well beyond the affordability of most people because it gives them the minimum viable product to launch with so they can do all the learnings they can and then bring that manufacturing cost down when they've learned how people actually use this. So it's packed with so much technology that's way more than most people are ever going to use, but it then lets them learn what is going to be in the cheaper version. That's not going to be $3,500, but might be $1,500, maybe the price of an iPhone. So next up is competitor analysis. And this is where you're literally looking over your shoulder or looking around you and going, what are the competitors in the marketplace doing? What are they doing that's so different? What are they doing that's innovative? Am I keeping up with them or am I falling behind with them? Being aware of your competitors, not being obsessed by them, but being aware of them is highly important because you need to know where you stand, not just for you on your own, but where you stand in the market, because these people are going to come up and try and knock you over because that's what competition does. So you want to know that you understand how they work, how their product works, how it's different from yours, and how you can differentiate yours from theirs as well. Now, interviews, let's have a quick drink of water. Interviews are like a survey, like a questionnaire, but they're a much more effective way of getting what we call qualitative feedback. People, when they're asked questions in person, really tend to open up a little bit more. Asking open-ended questions rather than yes/no questions can be a really good way of getting an idea of what people truly want, what their problem is that needs to be solved. And the design thinking process that goes into most startups these days does start with asking those questions of, rather than how would you use this product that I'm putting together, you'd ask the question of, how do you use this kind of product? What are the things that annoy you about this kind of product? So getting that qualitative response could completely reshape what you have in your head about the kind of product or service you want to deliver as a startup as well. Now, the team being such a major factor of it, could be split into a couple of different ways. You could have, for instance, people who are hired. You hire a team to come on board if you've got the funding and the ability to do it. But most startups tend to be a co-founder thing. The founders have a bit of money on the side. They both pool their resources and see what they can come up with. And they have either a partnership or a company limited by shares, somewhere where they're able to have some sort of equity in the business each, on top of hopefully being able to pay each other for their time as well. Now, in most startups, it's a bit of a hybrid model. You might start up with the co-founders. One of the co-founders is a bit of a visionary. The other one might be a marketing person. So they sort of play to their strengths, but before they know it, they need more people. They need a financial controller. They need other roles within the organization. And it becomes either a mingling of the co-founders and then some hired staff as well, or they may even bring in additional co-founders. Now, yes, it does water down the ownership, that you won't own as much of the company. You're working with boards and you're working with voting and all that sort of risk that comes with that sort of model. But at the same time, if you need the resources, you're going to have to get them somehow. So either bring people in as co-founders or you bring them in as new staff to help you out. There's no such thing as slave labor these days to be able to do these things for you. And those different people on your team will include the visionary. That could be you. If you're the person with the idea and with the drive and the motivation, that actually might be you. And if that's you, well, then that's great. You're the person who really understands what this product is and you have this dream, this vision. This is a very Elon Musk kind of person, someone who has this unshakable confidence in what the vision for their company is, whether it's right, whether it's wrong, whether it's feasible or viable. That's not the job of the visionary. That's the job of the people around them to let them know. People like the tech lead who says, is this thing actually feasible? Can we build this thing? And do we build this thing? And may actually be the person who does the building, or at least works with the people who are doing the building of that product or that service. In addition to the tech lead, you've got the sales and marketing people. There should be separate roles. Marketing is kind of like a putting the brand out there, making sure that the brand is correct, making sure that this idea gets in front of the right people. Sales then will be taking care of the inbound and making some outbound inquiries as well. So a sales team is often called business development because they're pretty much bringing in the money that's going to help this thing to work. So you need a really good sales and marketing person, or at least I'd probably say a really good sales and business development person, and then separately people who can assist you with your marketing. We find in startups that an operations manager is someone who is vital because they kind of know everything that's going on. Everything that's going on in the business, in the building, it's their business to know it. They're the person who probably works the closest with the founder or the visionary to be able to report back onto them how that vision's going. And their job is pretty much to carry out that vision within the resources they have. So the ops manager tends to be the mover and the shaker and has a lot of the control. The other person who has a lot of the control is the financial controller. They've got the money. They can see the cash flow. They can see the cash flow being depleted or being filled back up again, and can set targets and all sorts of KPIs. And a strong, very, very focused financial controller can make a big difference to the success and failure of a startup. Basically, this person, if they're financially incentivized to get shares and stocks and all that sort of thing, there can be some interesting twists and turns. But if they're just an employee, they might not have quite the creativity or the dedication to make sure this thing does work no matter what. The product manager is kind of like a person that sits between all of these. So the ops manager and the tech lead go, well, yes, we're going to make this happen. The sales manager says, I can't sell that. What are you doing? Produce something that I can be actually sellable. The marketing manager says, I can't even promote this. Like, look at it. It's terrible. It's in a terrible state. So the product manager is sort of sitting in the product design and the sales world, but also in the tech world and in the operations world. They often call a product owner. And that product owner is responsible to make sure that product is both awesome and sellable. And they've got to make those two things come together. It often takes a very specific kind of personality, someone who can communicate very well between very technical and very non-technical people on how to get this product just right from both angles. So let's talk about finance a little bit here, because this is not so much financial management or more about funding. And the funding side of a startup usually comes in the form of things like seed funding, which is the first bit of money you need to be able to develop the idea to get it out there into the market. Then there's angel investors, who are people who will take on either convertible debt or equity in the company, like a share in the company, in order for quite a sizable investment. Angel investors as well often provide a lot of, they've been startup founders themselves. So they're now funding other startups as part of what they enjoy. And their experience of running successful startups has given them expertise. They can come in as an angel investor to not just give you money, but to help to guide you in how to make that money work best for you and how to make that startup far more successful than it might be right now. Venture capital is usually organized around like several investors or institutions who are looking to invest in usually specific kinds of things. So for instance, Cap Vista is a venture capital firm in Singapore that we partner with, and they are specifically in the defense space. So they work with Singapore's Defense Funding Authority to be able to invest in new defense related things. You might not be anywhere near that, so Cap Vista wouldn't be yours, but there's other funding, for instance, in Paspalis Capital, which is the company that I work for through Darwin Innovation Hub, looks for a very specific areas such as hydrogen development, alternative energies, things that will certainly help in Northern Australia. Tech stuff is definitely an area they're looking for, but advanced manufacturing, things like aviation is another area that we invest in. So that's venture capital. Series funding then is when the business is going pretty well. It's already growing, it's scaling and all that, but it needs particular buckets of cash to be able to do the next stage. So let's say, for instance, we have a business that has grown to the point it's got 100,000 customers, and it's now making a profit of about $2.2 million. But we need to get it to a point where it's much more profitable, which means investing in some infrastructure and some people, which is going to cost about $5 million. So that Series A funding might be that $5 million to do that thing, to get that profit up and those costs down. But then there might be a Series B, which then is for another specific kind of activity they need to do, which might be expanding from Australia to Southeast Asia. Series C might be then going, well, now we're expanding out of Southeast Asia and Australia into the Americas. So those different levels of funding come in for very specific purposes, usually for specific goals they're looking for to support the growth they're going through. The two areas that are probably very limiting is bootstrapping. Now, bootstrapping means basically self-funding everything. So dragging yourself up by the bootstraps and moving yourself on. What it misses out on two very major things: the cash that you need to grow, because you need to find that money yourself. And it misses out often on external expertise. But it does have one major pro, and that is that bootstrapping yourself means you have 100% control of your product, 100% control of your company. You're not watering down that control. Crowdfunding through programs such as Swarmer, Birchal, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, all those different platforms, they do water down your ownership, because usually it produces a stake. You're giving away a small stake in your business to an investor. A lot of those ones like Birchal and Swarmer quite good for developing an idea of if you need a sudden injection of cash, but it's only a couple of $1 million, for instance, then you're not really giving away a huge amount of your company. You may actually give away in the process to 100 different investors about oh, I don't know, 0.001% of your company to each of those 100 investors. You may only give away 1% of the company in order to get that money in. A lot of these crowdfunding investors tend to be hobby investors and not really serious institutional investors who are looking for big returns on investment. Quite often they're just along for the ride because they really enjoy it and they might believe in the product. But they are very slow, very unreliable ways of moving, and they do tend to underperform quite a lot. We don't find that successful startups generally go down that path. Marketing and branding, I'm going to brush over this very, very quickly because we've got tons of other marketing and branding stuff coming up in the coming months. But basically, it's all about a balance between too little and too much. Too little marketing, nobody hears about what you're doing. Too much marketing and you're spending massive wads of cash to get a very unclear return on investment. So we're always looking for that balance between it. A lot of the marketing tends to go in a series of, first it goes out to your family and friends that you see every day and are in touch with every day, and they may want to be part of your business or part of buying your product. After that, you then go out to social media and your networks and your email list to get people who you may know or who may have expressed some early interest in what you're doing to come on board and buy the product or subscribe to your service. But again, too little means no one sees it. Too much means that you're spending a lot of money on something which has no clear return on investment that may not be, immediately noticeable. Likewise, when it comes to the scaling up and the growth, we often find that the place where startups fail the most is in this part, where they've come to a certain place, and to get it to be profitable, they have to make a big investment to get over that cliff to be able to go, oh yes, I've climbed up to the top of that mountain. Now I can get them big money. Problem is there, though, it takes money to make money in the case of scaling and growth. And bootstrappers don't want to share anything in their business. So they'll often look for things like loans, which puts a very big debt load on them that they actually have to pay back in cash. The difference with investment is that if the thing crashes and burns, well, you're not going to pay anything back because there's nothing to pay back with. If you don't pay back a bank, well, then you've got some serious financial repercussions that are going to happen. So scaling growth, we find that too much too soon is usually what happens. Certainly was I think my second startup was very much that case. I did too much scaling too soon with my digital marketing business, which wasn't a startup at all, just a regular business. Again, grew too much too soon back in about 2019. And then I had to sort of really pull that back again before I grew it much more slowly. I went too hard on getting too many clients and selling too much stuff and couldn't fulfill those promises because obviously I didn't have the staff to do it and didn't have the cash flow to buy the staff to do it. So I had to find things like alternatives, such as using offshore virtual assistants in the Philippines to be able to do it at a much lower rate so that I can then conserve that cash flow to be able to then later scale up and then sell that business. So that takes us through the basics of the of what a successful startup tends to have involved with it. So they'll tend to have those particular attributes, but they'll also tend to avoid other attributes. For instance, that moving too fast, scaling too fast, overspending on the things that don't matter. Very basic business rules. But I think one of the things that really comes through is that you're probably not going to be able to do it on your own and bootstrap it if you're trying to do something serious. If you've got something which has national or global impact, you probably need to work with something a lot more reliable in cash, maintaining a cash flow, having a runway of cash to keep that thing going, and also tapping into the potential of the expertise of the people who are around you, the people who can offer you help, advice, mentoring, and even introductions to the right people, including helping you find the right staff, rather than you having to scratch around and do it all for yourself all the time and not really know what you're doing. Doing it on your own is kind of it's a surefire way to fail at a startup, but doing it as a community and doing it with people who are there to do this, who've done this many times themselves and worked with others who are doing just what you're doing, that's a surefire way of actually getting some success out of your startup. So I hope you've learned something from that today. We'll have another free webinar again next week and right through until the end of the year. Every week, a new webinar. Just look out at darwininnovationhub.com.au or connect with me personally, Dante St James, on LinkedIn. I'll be sharing all my webinars and workshops, either they're in person or online as well. So you can take advantage of some of the experiences we've had. And I'll also be dragging in a few other experts from around here and across the country as well, rather than just being all about me. Because yeah, sure, I've had a couple of startups, a couple of them went really well, a couple of them went down in flames, but I'm not the only person who's had that experience. So we want to drag in a few others who have worked with startups as well. Thank you so much. Have a great week, and I hope to see you again in the next one.